What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on Voidship combat as part of Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, as Owlcat Games have provided me a version that's pretty close to the release version of the game, with basically only the last couple of acts missing, and a little bit of polish, of course. So I've been using that version to talk about all of the systems and changes at play ahead of the game's official launch, and one such guide is taking a look at Voidship combat, or space combat, as it is pretty much in its final version, because in the original alpha and even a bit in the beta, it was definitely rough around the edges, whereas now we're looking at more or less the finalized version of it, though I do think some of the numbers might change, and we'll talk about that a little more towards the end. But to kick this off and explain what this even is, essentially, as a rogue trader, we'll be managing our trade empire, which involves using our spaceship, or Voidship as it's known in the setting, to travel between various solar systems, manage our worlds, but as the setting of Warhammer 40k is fraught with danger, this often puts us at odds with all sorts of other ships, which leads us to the combat. However, your first introduction to your flagship, your main ship that you're actually using, is in character creation. This is mostly a cosmetic choice. You'll be able to upgrade and customize your ship as you play through the game via all sorts of weapons and side systems such as shields, etc. But as it is a big part of the game, you'll be able to pick what your ship initially looks like, on top of naming it as well. But you won't really get too much of a chance to actually use the ship until you're done with the prologue and find yourself in Act 1. Even in Act 1, you really only fly between a few planets as you are confined to one solar system. So your first introduction to the combat portion is right as you start Act 2, when they give you a pretty easy fight to serve as a tutorial to it. And while the combat here is a turn-based system like the base game itself, it does function quite a bit differently, as your ship has different movement zones and patterns alongside weapons. You can assign your companions to various posts which will affect certain things, so there's a good bit to go over. But let's start with the basics, which is movement. Essentially, every time you go to move your ship, there are 3 phases to it. Now, broadly speaking, these don't affect much outside of a few abilities that very specifically mention what phase of your movement they are available, but that's pretty few and far between. For the most part, this is simply the range at which you can move, and because your ship and the enemy ships are supposed to be moving at high speeds at all times, which doesn't exactly translate to turn-based combat very well, we see that represented through the 3 phases of movement and the fact that you have to take all of your movement in every turn. But the initial area, that is to say the blank square with simply the green outline, is your acceleration phase. That middle portion is your mid-movement, and the last portion is the end phase. Again, there's a few abilities where this matters, but for the most part it's just the range of your movement, and you have to take all of it. Now, you might notice that you cannot move freely, as your ship has a maneuverability and speed setting based on the engines your ship is equipped with, which will affect the size and range of each one of these individual phases, which changes how well you can, say, turn around. Because the direction your ship is facing is relatively important, as each of our weapons is designed to face a certain way, which means getting enemies in range of those weapons depends a lot on the direction your ship is facing, as both your ship and typically enemy ships are protected by shields. And as you take damage or deal damage to any ship, it's going to first eat into that shield. But as they get damaged, they only block some amount of it, and then based on the shield you're using, it might not reduce all of the damage you're taking anyway, so it's not a foolproof measure to protect yourself with. But one of the very basic abilities you'll get is the ability to restart your shields. Should they fail, you can fire them back up again, but that will slow you down for a couple turns. And there's also an early ability that will allow you to reinforce a section of your shields, which you want to try to do before you get hit, to mitigate some of the incoming damage. Now, the nice thing about this is that on your turn, you can use every single one of your weapons once. Provided you're in range to hit something, of course, you can use it. This means that if you're careful about your positioning and maneuvering, you can use every single one of your ship's weapons. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, because another way to give your ships abilities and options is by assigning your companions to posts. There are a total of 6 posts on your ship, each of them associated with a stat, which you can see when you assign someone to it. And when you start unlocking abilities for your ship here in a little bit, those abilities are associated with a certain post. And having an officer with a stat that is high in the associated value is going to do things like reduce turns or increase the effect of the abilities associated with that post. Now, typically, each one of your officers can utilize one of their abilities of the 3 per post, I believe it is, every single turn as well. So in order for you to use a post and its abilities, you have to have someone assigned to it, and you have to also know the skills by leveling up, because your void ship has its own level up paths. However, unlike your character, your ship upgrade paths as you complete combat, earn experience, is abilities and ultimates. Now, each post also has an associated ultimate ability. However, unlike your regular abilities, which can be used once per turn and then they have a cooldown associated with them, ultimates can only be used once per combat, and then after combat, you have to wait even longer for them to recharge based on the number of warp jumps you make. Though in combat, many of them can be used repeatedly for a set number of turns, and some of the ultimates include things like sending out boarding parties or attacking enemy ships with warp abilities, such as Empyrean Storm. And needless to say, these are very typically high damage, high value abilities that you just can't use all the time. So your companions are also going to play a pretty big role in Voidship combat, as you have to assign them to posts to be able to use the abilities associated with said post, and then they will grant a beneficial effect if they have the right stats, adjusting cooldowns and the like. But we are not done yet, as now we can talk about parts. Your ship can be upgraded in more ways than just leveling up, and this is through your ship parts, your hull, and your ram. Now, a ship is going to have 5 weapon slots: the port, starboard, prow, dorsal, and secondary prow weapon, representing some of the directions that these weapons can face. And then depending on the individual part, they might have a different range. For instance, lance weapons typically fire in a longer straight line, whereas putting a cannon in a dorsal slot typically gives you a wider, like 270-degree arc, whereas something like torpedoes lets you drop torpedoes onto the battlefield, which then have their own movement path independent of your ship, and they kind of spawned in as like their own little unit that you'll move. So what type of attacks your ship has in each individual slot and direction is largely up to you, as you will be able to find and move these parts around as you see fit. In addition to that, however, your ship also has 4 more slots for the engines, shields, auspex, and armor. Now, for the most part, these are self-explanatory, but your engines affect how far and how maneuverable your ship is. But your engine affects things like how far you can move, how maneuverable it is, and how much distance you can cover on your turn. Your shields, of course, indicates the strength of your shields and how they recharge. Your auspex is actually your chance to hit, alongside your chance to crit, whereas your armor is simply the base damage reduction you'll take when you get hit. But then, these 2 things over to the side here that have a little upgrade thing are your hull and your ram. As you complete space battles and even purchase them from vendors sometimes, you can pick up scrap. Scrap is effectively your upgrade material for your ship. You'll spend it to upgrade your base hull health or your ram. Your ram, if you don't have weapons and an enemy is directly in front of you, can be used to just ram their ship, though you'll take a little bit of damage yourself from doing that. And if you upgrade your ram, you can actually do a lot of damage that way, but it does limit your movement a little bit. Though I will say it does not look like any of these change much in terms of like the visual appearance of the ship in this menu, by the way, which was a little bit of a bummer, but you know, it is what it is. Now, I would say that's the bulk of what to know about Voidship combat ahead of time, but we do have a few more things I want to cover before we call it a day. For starters, if you're wondering if you'll be by yourself, typically yes. However, it is possible to get a small secondary ship to accompany you based on the colony management, which is likely to be my next guide, but essentially in Rogue Trader there will be colonies that you manage and you can complete tasks for them via development projects, that kind of thing. And one of those colonies has a project that will grant you a secondary ship and a couple notes on that ship. So it won't fire on enemies outside of dropping torpedoes that will then try to hit them. And while it can be a little hit or miss, the torpedoes themselves will deal a lot of damage if they hit the enemy. It just doesn't happen very often. But both the torpedoes that ship lays and that ship itself will provide convenient distractions for enemies to waste their turn on rather than trying to attack your flagship. And that secondary ship doesn't need to be healed or cared for. You don't have to spend scrap repairing it. If it dies in combat, it just restarts back with you the next time you enter combat, so you don't have to take care of it at all. And given how rich a Rogue Trader is supposed to be, I like to think it's just a new ship. And I would say that's the biggest upgrade you can get in that manner, but in developing your colonies, you can actually give both your team and your void ship like kind of passive bonuses, so you might want to keep an eye on that as well. I wanted to talk a bit about where to acquire parts. You can occasionally, via events and things, find spaceship parts while exploring or handling other objectives, but the bulk of them is going to come from a very specific trader, which is the Imperial Navy. Your rogue trader, managing a trade empire, does a lot of trading. And again, this will be part of the colony guide next, but unlike other vendors, this vendor only takes very specific items from you to increase your reputation. And you get said items by destroying enemy ships in combat. So when you start actually winning some of these fights, you will gain their trophies and things as rewards for completing the combat, and then you can trade those parts to the Navy vendor, which will increase your reputation, and combined with your rogue trader's profit factor, which is this game's analog to money, but it works a little differently, you'll be able to buy new parts for your ship. Which leads me into a small section here that I wanted to tack on to the end of this because I can see a couple of things getting changed here before release. This is more or less the final version, but some numbers, etc. might change, as I mentioned earlier, and in that regard, there are two things I want to talk about. For starters, the reputation for the Navy vendor is a little too hard to get. There's not a ton of Voidship combat, and the initial amount of parts you have to give this guy to get your reputation high enough to actually buy anything is just too high. I wasn't able to start buying parts for my ship until Act 2 was almost over, and then in Act 3 you don't really use your ship much either. Which means in basically all of Act 2, despite actively engaging with this system, doing my best with it, and even getting pretty good towards the end, I wasn't really able to upgrade much because I just couldn't get to a point where I could actually buy anything from the vendor they present to you. So I'd be surprised if those metrics don't see some adjustment just to make that vendor a little more available. And then the second thing is actually around your ultimate abilities. So Owlcat has dealt with some bugs in their games before, I think it's safe to say. Kingmaker was pretty rough, and Wrath of the Righteous had plenty of issues on its own, but while Rogue Trader has mostly been better than both of those, one of, I would say, the more serious bugs I've ran into with this game is actually your ultimate abilities in Voidship combat, because sometimes the cooldown just doesn't ever stop. Everything else seems to work appropriately, but I would consistently run into an issue where my ultimates would just never come off of cooldown, even when it says they were done with their cooldown timer, which, while significant, is really the only issue I had with the system as it stands. But as you lead your flagship to victory across various space battles, you'll be pitted against all sorts of enemies: the Drukhari, the Eldari, simple pirates, enemies from the warp, and each of those ships has their own sort of attack pattern and setting, and in that regard, I would tell you that learning about what each enemy does and how things work can go a long way. For instance, Drukhari and Eldari like to shroud their ships instead of using shields specifically, so you'll have to attack them multiple times to hit, and for the Eldari, this just means hitting them more than once, and for the Drukhari, you really want to close distance, as they have an ability that really reduces your chance to hit the farther away you are, but if you get right up on them, that mostly goes away. So outside of everything I've just mentioned, there is a little bit of tactics and strategy based on the exact enemy you're fighting as well. But overall, I would say it's a decent system. I've actually enjoyed it myself with this particular version. I honestly didn't care for it too much in the alpha and the beta, but here, where they've cleaned a lot of the UI and everything's mostly working correctly, outside of those ultimate abilities, towards the end of Act 2, when I was starting to get my ship really upgraded and getting all the abilities for my officers and the ultimates and stuff, when they were working, were fun to mess around with. So once all of those cylinders were firing, I did find myself really enjoying this system, and if they make some minor adjustments, I think it could be a lot more fun than their previous systems, such as, say, the Crusade battles in Wrath of the Righteous, which I was neutral about, but, weren't very fun, to be honest, either. That is going to do it for this video, though. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you found it informative. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. If you have any other questions about anything I didn't cover, by all means, let me know. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.